Caleb Mercer rode the north fence at dawn, breath turning to crystals, listening to Flint's hooves crack ice over snow, and watching Valley hold silence. Winter lay across the Bitterroot like a lid, sealing creeks, flattening grass, and making every sound travel too far, then vanish too quickly. Caleb's mind stayed on chores, haystacks, thin cattle, and the coming calves, because ordinary thoughts were safer than deeper ones. A man could fix a gate, mend wire, or doctor a heifer, but he couldn't bargain with February or talk sense into death. He had learned that lesson young, when fever took his sister Rose, and his father dug until his hands bled through gloves. Today the sky hung low and pewter gray, promising more snow by nightfall, the kind that drifted fences shut and swallowed tracks. Flint moved carefully, ears flicking, breath steaming, as if the horse could feel the weather shifting its weight behind the ridgeline. Caleb crested a small rise, and the valley opened wide, white prairie rolling toward distant cottonwoods, and a shallow, shadowed draw. In that draw sat the cemetery, a crooked fenced patch of forgotten stones, and there, impossibly, something moved against the snow. At first he thought it was an animal. Then the shape straightened, and he saw the swing of arms, hard, rhythmic, desperate. Caleb slowed Flint and narrowed his eyes, squinting through glare as pale sun burned on crusted drifts, making the world look sharp and cruel. The figure was a woman, alone, driving a shovel downward, and each strike rang back dull and metallic, like steel arguing with stone. He could tell from distance the ground wouldn't yield, not after weeks of hard freeze, not without heat, patience, or explosives. Yet she kept swinging, shoulders jerking with every rebound, as if stubbornness could shame earth into opening for her. Caleb urged Flint forward, unease tightening his chest, because near the woman lay a small pine box, too small for comfort. The box sat in snow like a misplaced tool chest, but its shape was unmistakable, and Caleb felt his mouth go dry. He knew that size, that cruel proportion. That way wood could look harmless and still carry the heaviest thing a person owned. Closer now, he recognized her profile. Dark hair whipped loose beneath a scarf, coat patched at elbows, posture rigid with grief. Hannah Doyle, the widow from east of the river, the one folks watched in town like she was a wager. She didn't look up, didn't hear him, because wind stole sound and flung it over the empty prairie like chaff. Caleb dismounted well back and led Flint in by the reins, boots crunching, careful not to startle her into swinging that shovel at air. Hannah struck again, and the blade snapped back, jolting her shoulders, and she staggered, then caught herself with furious pride. Caleb spoke softly, voice small against wind. "Ma'am," and Hannah spun, shovel raised, eyes wide and wild with exhaustion. Her face was gray with cold, cheeks chapped raw, tears frozen into bright tracks, and her hands shook around split leather gloves. "I don't need help," she said, but her voice cracked, betraying the lie she tried to live inside. Caleb looked past her at the coffin, at the shallow scrape in earth, at the futility of it, and he didn't argue. "You do today," he answered, gentle but firm, like a man stating weather, not offering opinion, and Hannah's shoulders sagged. Pride flared in her eyes, then dimmed, because even pride has limits when a body is cold and empty and alone. Caleb held out his hand for the shovel without grabbing, letting her choose, and after a beat, her fingers loosened. The shovel slid into his grip, heavy with more than wood and steel, and Hannah's hands fell empty at her sides. Caleb planted his boots and drove the blade down with all his strength, feeling the jolt travel through his arms into his ribs. The ground resisted like iron, but he leaned, twisted, worried the edge, and at last a small crack answered back. A chunk broke free, dark soil clinging to it like reluctant permission, and Caleb exhaled a white plume into the wind. He dug again and again, not looking at Hannah, because questions could wait, and words might break something open too soon. Hannah sank beside the coffin, one palm flat on the lid, as if she could keep it from drifting away with the snow. The cemetery held only shovel scrape, wind hiss, and Caleb's breathing, growing heavier as sweat formed, then froze beneath his collar. Minutes stretched, measured in effort, until hoofbeats approached and Caleb straightened, seeing two riders crossing the white field fast. Elias Rook and Jonah Pike, his ranch hands, arrived without being summoned, because out here, men recognized trouble like smoke. They took in the coffin, the woman kneeling, the half-dug hole, and neither asked what happened, because the scene explained itself. Elias dismounted and pulled a pickaxe from his saddle. Jonah took a shovel, and they joined Caleb as if stepping into prayer. The pickaxe cracked the crust with sharp, brutal blows, letting shovels bite deeper, and the grave grew inch by stubborn inch. They traded tools, traded places, letting muscles rest for seconds, breath steaming, fingers numbing, shoulders burning under wool and frost. Hannah stayed kneeling, silent, a sentry beside the small box, her gaze fixed, like if she looked away everything would fall apart. Caleb kept his jaw set, remembering Rose, remembering his father's hands, remembering how the earth never felt soft enough for goodbyes. At last, the hole reached a depth that felt like enough, though no depth ever felt right, and the men stepped back. Elias removed his hat first, Jonah followed, then Caleb, and the sudden quiet made the wind sound louder than before. Hannah rose on trembling legs and lifted the pine coffin, and the way it barely weighed anything stabbed Caleb in the chest. He stepped forward instinctively, but Hannah shook her head once, not angry, just needing this moment to belong to her. She knelt and lowered the box into the ground, arms shaking, and it settled with a soft sound too small for finality. Her lips moved silently, words meant for Samuel alone, and Caleb swallowed hard, feeling helpless in the only way a strong man can. Caleb drew his worn Bible from his coat, pages creased from use, and asked, "If you'll permit me," keeping his voice steady. Hannah nodded once without looking up, and Caleb opened to familiar passages, because familiarity was the closest thing to comfort he had. He read about lambs gathered and carried, about the broken-hearted, about mercy that might exist beyond the reach of frozen ground. Elias and Jonah stood bowed, hats pressed to chests, while wind tugged coats and snow dust skittered along old stones. Hannah's shoulders began to shake, then grief broke loose in harsh, wrenching sobs that sounded torn from somewhere deep and raw. Caleb kept reading until the words ran out, then closed the book carefully, letting silence settle like another layer of snow. The men filled the grave gently, not throwing dirt, placing it, patting the mound smooth with the backs of their shovels. Elias lashed 2 pine branches into a simple cross and drove it firm at the head, deep enough to stand against wind. "Need a stone come spring," Jonah murmured, and Caleb nodded, because promises mattered more when said quietly, without show. Hannah stood beside the mound, arms wrapped around herself, staring, as if sight alone could keep memory from slipping away. The sun dipped toward the western rim, light thinning blue, and cold sharpened fast, turning every breath into knife-edged air. Elias touched his hat brim toward Hannah. Jonah nodded once, and they rode off, leaving dark cuts in snow that wind would erase. Caleb stayed, because leaving her alone now would feel like reopening the grave, and he wasn't that kind of man. He waited a moment, then asked softly, "Where's your place?" And Hannah answered, 2 miles east, voice distant and hollow. "I'll follow you home," Caleb said, not as a question. And Hannah hesitated, pride flickering, then nodded once. She walked to her horse tied to the cemetery fence, mounted stiffly, moving like someone older than her years. Caleb swung onto Flint and rode behind at a respectful distance, letting silence do its work, letting her grieve without audience. The setting sun painted snow pink and gold, beauty that felt rude, because beauty didn't mean mercy and never had. Hannah's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she rode, and Caleb stared past her, guarding her back like it mattered. Her cabin appeared, tucked against a hillside for wind protection, smoke curling from the chimney, a thin sign of life refusing to quit. Hannah dismounted and went inside without looking back, and a moment later, lamplight warmed the window like a small, stubborn heart. Caleb waited until he was sure she wouldn't stumble back into the cold, then turned Flint toward home, throat tight with thoughts. That night, Hannah sat at her table without removing her coat, hands flat on rough wood, unable to feel warmth or anything. 3 days earlier, Samuel had been alive, feverish but breathing, and Hannah had ridden through darkness to fetch Dr. Harrow from town. The baby's heat burned against her chest, frightening, unreal, and the ride felt endless, hooves pounding like a clock running down. The doctor came back, kind in the brisk, helpless way men become when medicine runs out, his bag clinking with bottles and hope. By the time they reached the cabin, Samuel's breathing had changed, shallow and wrong, like a lantern sputtering before going dark. By dawn, he was gone, and the silence afterward felt louder than any crying, because it had no place to spend itself. The doctor helped Hannah wash the tiny body, wrap it in clean linen. Then he left, promising to send word to neighbors. No one came, not because they were cruel, but because January made survival feel selfish, and everyone had their own roofs to shovel. Hannah understood that, which was part of the cruelty, because understanding didn't soften grief. It only made it lonelier and more logical. 14 months earlier, her husband Matthew had died under a fallen tree, timber crushing him while he cut for winter heat. Neighbors helped at first, bringing food, offering hands. Then weeks passed, and kindness thinned like soup stretched too far. Frontier mercy had limits. People returned to their own stock and children and fences, and Hannah learned to do everything herself. She hauled water through ice, mended harness, split wood, learned to swing an axe until blisters turned to callus and pride. When she discovered she was pregnant, she felt terror and gratitude tangled together. Because Matthew was gone, but some peace remained. Samuel arrived in May, delivered by a midwife who stayed 2 days, then left, wagon wheels fading down the track. For months, the cabin held small sounds, breathing, coos, the wet hiccup of laughter, and Hannah believed she might manage. Then fever came, sudden as a wolf in fog, and 3 nights later she was measuring pine boards meant for a cradle. She built the coffin herself yesterday. Lining it with cloth from her wedding dress, white fabric meant for beginnings turned into an ending. This morning she loaded it onto the wagon, drove to the cemetery, unloaded alone, and lifted a shovel with grim determination. She meant to do it alone, because alone was what she knew. But the ground refused, and after hours, her arms shook uselessly. Then Caleb Mercer appeared, dismounted without ceremony, took the shovel without asking permission, and started digging like it was necessary work. When his men arrived, they dug too. 3 strangers breaking frozen earth for a child they'd never met. And it broke Hannah. Not loudly at first, just a crack inside her armor. Because kindness can feel like betrayal when you've survived by refusing it. She sat now by the stove, feeding logs into flame, watching heat bloom on iron, knowing heat couldn't touch the cold inside. She cried until exhaustion dulled her edges, then sat in silence, listening to wind rake the roof, wondering how tomorrow could exist. In the dark hours, she remembered Samuel's small fist gripping her finger, remembered his weight, and the memory felt like hunger. She thought about the cemetery, the men's hats off, the cross standing, and she felt something unfamiliar beneath grief. Shame at being helped. It wasn't rational, but grief rarely was, and she fell asleep with her coat still on, because comfort felt undeserved and pointless. Wheels crunched outside after sunrise, and Hannah woke stiff, heart thudding as if the sound meant judgment arriving at her door. She peered through the window and saw Caleb's wagon, loaded high with split firewood, Caleb standing in the bed, tossing logs down. The day was bright, sun glinting off fresh snow that had fallen overnight, and the clean whiteness felt wrong, like the world lying. Hannah stepped outside, cold biting her cheeks, and Caleb touched his hat brim and said simply, "Morning," voice steady. "Brought wood," he added, nodding at the pile. "Thought you might be running low," as if offering wood was ordinary. "I have enough," Hannah replied automatically, pride speaking before sense, and Caleb answered, "Then you'll have more," and kept unloading. Hannah stood frozen a moment, jaw tight, torn between ordering him away and collapsing into relief she didn't want to admit. She grabbed an armful of logs and began stacking, because helping was the only way she could accept the gift without feeling owned. Caleb didn't thank her, didn't comment, just stacked alongside her, silence respectful, the sound of wood thumping steady and solid. When the wagon was empty, Caleb nodded toward the barn, observed the door hung crooked, and said he'd fix it if she'd show tools. Hannah led him to Matthew's toolbox, worn handles polished by use, and watched Caleb replace the broken hinge with spare hardware. The door swung smooth afterward, a small miracle, and Hannah said, "Thank you," though the words felt too small for the dead. Caleb wiped his hands, glanced toward the cabin, and asked, "Coffee, if you've got it." Like conversation could stay practical. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and grief. The empty cradle sat in the corner, and Caleb's eyes flicked once, then away. That single glance felt like respect, not pity. And Hannah poured coffee, hands shaking less than yesterday, because routine steadied her. They sat at the table in silence, cups steaming, wind rasping outside, and the silence didn't feel like abandonment for once. Caleb finally asked about hay, and Hannah lied, saying she had enough, because admitting need felt like stepping off a cliff. Caleb didn't challenge the lie. He only said he had surplus and would bring some, no charge, voice calm, like stating weather. Hannah tried to insist on paying, and Caleb answered, "Come spring," then added, "Or maybe you can't," and left it there. Before leaving, he mentioned his sister Rose dying of fever, and how he remembered his father digging, thinking earth shouldn't be so hard. Hannah whispered she was sorry, and Caleb nodded, saying you don't forget, then stood, hat in hand, and said he'd return. "You don't have to," Hannah said, reflexive defense, and Caleb answered, "I know," then, "But I will," and stepped outside. Hannah watched his wagon disappear over the ridge, feeling a strange emptiness when the sound faded, like a door closing too gently. 3 days later, he returned with hay, stacking bales beside her barn without fanfare, then checking her fence line where wind had snapped wire. A week later, he brought lamp oil and coffee, and he repaired a loose board on her roof, working like it was his own. He never stayed long, never asked for thanks, never sat and stared at her grief, and that restraint made his help feel cleaner. Hannah began timing chores so she'd be near the cabin when he arrived, telling herself it was practical, though she knew better. On days he didn't come, the cabin felt louder, and she hated herself for noticing, because needing company felt like weakness. One afternoon, he noticed the fiddle hanging on the wall, wood dark with age, and asked if she played, voice casual. "Used to," Hannah said, and Caleb nodded and told her to play now, not as command, but as invitation she could refuse. Hannah almost refused, because music felt like betrayal. But she also felt hollow, and hollow things echo unless filled. She took down the fiddle, tucked it beneath her chin, and drew the bow across strings. The first note wavered, then steadied. The tune was simple, an old folk air her mother had taught in Illinois, and it filled the cabin like light seeping into cracks. Caleb sat with coffee, listening without moving, and when she finished, he said quietly, "That's real fine," as if it mattered. Hannah swallowed, surprised by the sting behind her eyes, and asked if he played, and Caleb snorted he couldn't carry a tune. She played another melody, then another, fingers loosening, and for a few minutes grief sat quieter, not gone, just less commanding. Afterward, Caleb rose, touched his hat brim, and left without making the moment sentimental, which somehow made it more precious. February arrived with deceptive calm, clear skies, afternoons where sun softened snow into glitter, and Hannah almost believed winter might ease. Then one day, the light looked wrong, air still and heavy, and Caleb saw clouds building northwest, like a dark wall marching. He saddled Flint and rode hard toward Hannah's place, because storms out here weren't weather. They were events that rearranged lives. When Caleb reached her cabin, flakes were already falling, fat and quiet at first, then thicker as wind began to rise. Hannah was outside, trying to drive her small herd toward the barn, but the cattle spooked, scattering in the growing howl. Caleb dismounted and joined her without speaking, stepping into paths, using his body and voice to turn animals like you turn a river. Snow turned sharp, driven sideways, stinging cheeks, and visibility shrank until barn and cabin were dark shapes in a white roar. Together, they got the last cow inside, and Caleb slammed the barn door and dropped the latch as drifts piled against boards. Hannah shouted that he couldn't ride home, and Caleb answered he'd sleep in the barn. But Hannah snapped, "Don't be foolish." They ran 30 yards through whiteout, bent against wind that tried to knock them down. Snow in eyes, mouths, collars everywhere. Inside the cabin, Caleb bolted the door while Hannah fed the stove until flames roared, and the small room filled with heat and tension. The empty cradle sat like a quiet witness beside the bed, and Caleb felt suddenly aware of being a man in a widow's cabin. "I can sleep by the fire," he said quickly. And Hannah answered there were blankets in the chest, voice practical, clipped, controlled. The first day they moved carefully around each other, keeping distance in a room too small for comfort, speaking only of safe things. Hannah cooked beans and bread, Caleb chopped wood and checked the door drifts, and the storm screamed outside like something alive. By night, snow buried the lower half of the windows, turning the world into white noise, and the cabin became the whole universe. The second day was worse. Wind shook walls, and their polite distance began to feel like another kind of loneliness pressed close. They played cards by lamplight, hands moving, eyes rarely meeting, because looking too directly felt dangerous when everything else was stripped away. Caleb whittled a piece of pine into a small animal shape without thinking, and Hannah mended a tear that didn't need mending. They read from one of Hannah's books when silence grew heavy, Caleb listening as if words could build shelter inside the mind. Night came early, and the firelight threw shadows across the ceiling like moving branches, and Hannah lay down, trying to sleep. Sometime after midnight, she woke crying. Not soft tears, but harsh sobs that shook her whole body, grief demanding space in the dark. Caleb lay still at first, staring at rafters, uncertain, then rose and knelt beside her bedroll, voice low, asking her to tell him. "Tell me about him," Caleb said, and Hannah's breath hitched, pride fighting, then collapsed under the weight of needing witness. Words poured out. Samuel's birth, his first smile, the way he grabbed her hair, the sound of his laugh like water over stones. She spoke of the fever, sudden and burning, the desperate ride for the doctor, the terrible moments Samuel's breathing changed and slowed. She spoke of holding him after, waiting for warmth that would never return, feeling anger at God, at winter, at herself, at everything. Caleb listened without trying to fix it, because grief wasn't a broken fence. It was a landscape, and you survived by walking through. When Hannah's words ran out, she covered her face, shaking, and Caleb spoke quietly of his sister Rose dying when he was 12. He remembered his father digging, remembered his mother going silent for months, remembered learning that loss didn't pass. It changed shape. Hannah asked if it got easier, voice small, and Caleb answered it got different, that you made room, learned to carry it. They talked until dawn, voices low, storm howling. Two people admitting truths usually kept buried, because burial felt safer than exposure. When gray morning came, the wind still raged, but something between them had shifted, not healed, not solved, just opened, like a latch lifted. On the third day, the storm began to break. Wind softened, snow stopped falling, and quiet returned so abruptly it felt suspicious. Caleb dug a path to the barn, sweat freezing on his neck, and checked the cattle in Flint, then returned, packing to ride. Hannah made coffee for his journey, hands steadier now, eyes raw but clearer, as if speaking Samuel's name aloud had changed something. Caleb stood by the door with coat on, gloves tight, feeling the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities and fear. "Thank you," Hannah said, and the words held wood, hay, digging, listening, staying, everything she couldn't name without breaking again. Caleb nodded. "Thank you for letting me," he answered, meaning the same, and he promised he'd be back when roads cleared. Hannah nodded once, not trusting her voice, and Caleb stepped out into the bright, brutal snow, mounting Flint without looking back. He rode home with a strange ache in his chest, something like hope and guilt tangled together, because hope felt disloyal to grief. A week later he rode into town for supplies, and the general store buzzed with winter survivor energy, people desperate for stories, besides weather. Conversation dipped when Caleb entered, then resumed in softer tones, and he felt eyes on him like pins, not hostile, just hungry. Near the counter, Mrs. Lottie Bracken leaned toward the shopkeeper's wife, voice loud enough to travel, and spoke of Caleb's visits. "That Mercer man's been out to Hannah Doyle's awful regular," she said, 3 times a week, turning help into spectacle. "Well, she's alone," the other woman replied, and Mrs. Bracken pursed her lips and said alone was one thing, but a man and widow. Caleb set his goods down and paid, jaw tight, refusing to argue with crows. But the word charity floated after him like soot. Outside, whispers followed, and Caleb rode home angry, not at gossip itself, but at the doubt it planted in his own mind. Why had he kept going to Hannah, he asked himself. Was it neighborliness, or was it need, some selfish hunger to feel important? He hated the question, because it mattered, because if his help was poisoned by ego, then he'd been taking even while giving. That night, he lay awake listening to wind, examining his motives like a splinter, and decided he needed clarity before he returned. So he stayed away, telling himself it was honor, telling himself it was restraint, and 1 week became 2, then stretched longer. Absence brought clarity too, but not the kind he expected, because he missed Hannah herself, her quiet, her fiddle, her presence, not the work. The ranch felt louder without her, which was ridiculous, because she lived miles away, but his mind kept turning toward her anyway. He found himself wanting to tell her small things, the first calf born early, the creek breaking ice, the way geese returned. Nonsense. Nonsense, except it wasn't, because wanting to share the world with someone was how loneliness announced itself, plain and embarrassing. Caleb still didn't go, because fear dressed itself as principle, and he told himself he was protecting Hannah from his uncertainty. Then the decision was taken from him on a gray morning when Hannah rode into his yard, straight-backed, eyes sharp as flint. "My milk cow's sick," she said without greeting, bloat, and asked if he knew what to do, as if asking cost her pride. Caleb swallowed relief and dread together, grabbed his kit, and rode with her in silence through thawing snow and patches of exposed grass. The cow lay swollen in the stall, breathing hard, and Caleb worked carefully, relieving pressure, dozing her, watching until her eyes steadied. "She'll recover," he said, and Hannah nodded once, then held out coins, and Caleb started to refuse, then saw her pride. He took the money, because to refuse would insult her, and in that barn, with cold air and animal breath, Hannah finally asked why. "Why'd you stop coming?" she demanded, voice controlled, and Caleb answered truthfully, "Town talk," feeling ashamed to say it aloud. Hannah's mouth tightened. "And you let it steer you," she said, and Caleb admitted the talk made him question his motives. Hannah stepped closer, eyes hard, and said she'd survived her husband dying, survived burying her baby, survived winter alone. "I don't need your charity," she said, each word hammered. "If you come back, it must be because you want to. Nothing else." She paused, and the pause cut deeper than anger. "Not obligation, not pity, not conscience," she said, and Caleb felt his chest cave. Then she turned and walked out, leaving him standing with truth settling like cold in his bones, because she wasn't cruel. She was right. Caleb rode home and worked until his muscles shook, hauling water, breaking ice, fixing fences, trying to exhaust thoughts with labor. But exhaustion didn't erase truth. It only stripped away excuses, and he realized he loved Hannah. Not perfectly, not purely, but truly. He loved her strength, her stubborn honesty, her refusal to perform grief for others, her ability to sit in silence without making it weapon. He understood that nobody's motives were spotless. What mattered was honesty. And if he wanted her, he had to stop hiding behind doubt. April came with thaw and mud, and the valley changed color. Brown grass showing through retreating snow. Sunlight warm enough to sting. Geese flew north in ragged formations, calling, and the sound felt like a dare, like the world insisting life moved forward regardless. Caleb saddled Flint and rode to Hannah's claim with his heart hammering, feeling foolish and determined, like a man stepping into water. He found Hannah outside turning soil in a garden plot, sleeves rolled, hands dark with earth, and the sight hit him like relief. She straightened when she saw him, guarded, not smiling, but not sending him away, and Caleb stopped at the edge of the plot. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, and Hannah planted her spade and faced him fully, waiting without softness. Caleb didn't dress it up. "I love you," he said. Plain words, heavy words, and Hannah blinked, as if braced for something else. He told her it wasn't pity, wasn't obligation, that he loved how she kept going, how she made something honest in a hard world. He said he knew she still grieved, that he wasn't asking her to stop, only asking if, when she was ready, she'd let him in. Silence stretched, wind moving gently now, and Hannah's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady when she said she needed to show him something. They rode together to the cemetery, the path familiar and painful, and the valley looked different in spring, less dead, more waiting. The cottonwood near the fence showed buds, and grass had begun to stitch green across the mound where Samuel lay. The crude wooden cross still stood, weathered but straight, and Hannah dismounted and walked to it with slow, deliberate steps. Caleb stayed a few paces back, giving her space, because grief was private even when shared, and he wouldn't crowd it. Hannah knelt and rested her hand on the earth. "Samuel," she whispered, voice trembling, and Caleb felt his throat tighten. "This is Caleb," she said softly, "the man who helped me when I couldn't help myself," and her shoulders shook once. "I need to tell you something," she continued, speaking as if the words needed the grave's witness to become true. "I'm going to keep living," she said, then paused, breath catching. "Not just surviving." And the wind seemed to listen. "And that means letting myself love someone again," she whispered, hand pressing the grass as gently as smoothing a child's hair. She stood and turned to Caleb, tears tracking her cheeks, and she smiled, small but real, and said, "Yes, when I'm ready." Caleb stepped forward and took her hands, work rough and strong, hands that had built, buried, endured, and he held them carefully. "There's no rush," he said, voice quiet, and Hannah squeezed his fingers and answered, "I know." And in that, trust lived. They stood beside the grave together, two people scarred by loss, choosing to risk love without pretending love erased anything. Spring didn't apologize for winter. It simply arrived and insisted the world could be green again, and that insistence felt like mercy. They married in May, quietly, without spectacle, Elias and Jonah as witnesses, a circuit preacher passing through to speak the words. Hannah wore a simple blue calico dress she'd sewn herself, carrying wildflowers, prairie rose and blue flax, because life was still allowed. Caleb wore his Sunday best and watched her like she was something rare, because she was, not in beauty, but in courage. Afterward, they drank coffee and ate a cake Elias attempted, dense enough to be laughed at. And Hannah laughed, startling everyone. In the weeks that followed, they learned each other's habits, argued sometimes because stubborn didn't disappear, and made space for grief at the table. When Jonah finished carving a stone for Samuel, they set it in place and planted flax around it, and the grave looked less abandoned, more held. That evening, Hannah played her fiddle on the porch while Caleb repaired tack, and the music drifted across pasture like smoke. It was sudden strong at once, proof sorrow and hope could share the same air without one destroying the other. Caleb watched her bow move steady, eyes closed, and felt gratitude rise, not for loss, but for the moment he'd chosen not to look away. Winter had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything, and in the wide valley under an open sky, that mattered. Two people who had once stood alone had learned to carry grief together, and to make room for love anyway, without lying about cost. The sun sank behind the hills, painting the land gold and rose, lamps warming windows, and wind smoothing grass like a hand. Caleb listened to the fiddle fade into evening and understood the simplest truth the frontier ever offered. You don't outrun sorrow. You outlive it, day by day. And if you're lucky, you find someone willing to walk beside you while you do. Hannah opened her eyes after the last note and caught Caleb watching, and her small smile held both pain and promise, honest as weather. And in that honesty, the valley felt less like a place that killed, and more like a place where the living could still choose.